Hello all! So this video is just going to be a video of my hand. I'm still working on setting up a good document cam situation so you can see me and the whiteboard at the same time. But hopefully within the next week I'll have this sort of streamlined. For now, you're just going to get my hand explaining some things to you. So this video is just going to be a short video that wraps up Plato. We spent a lot of time already talking about Plato's theory of the forms, so there's just one last piece of this that I want to introduce, and that's Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So, as you'll remember from lecture, Plato has his theory of the forms, and basically the claim that he's making is that there are two levels of reality. There's the physical reality that we interact with using our sense perceptions, and there's the formal reality that we can only access using intellect, reason, using our conscious mind. And Plato says that formal reality is the most real. It's where all of the eternal, perfect, objective objects exist, and they're conceptual objects, but they're mind independent, so we can access them using our minds, our reason, our intellect, but they're going to exist whether or not we know about them or whether or not we think about them. In physical reality, we have physical objects. So this is where you're going to find trees, rutabagas, pieces of pumpkin pie, all of that stuff. And physical reality can only be accessed using sense perceptions. Now, according to Plato, physical reality is an imperfect pale copy of formal reality. So this is just a sketch of Plato's divided line that we discussed in class. But basically, we've got a hierarchy on the left for our metaphysics and a hierarchy on the right for our epistemology. And the way this works is every level is sort of less real and less perfect than the level above it. So starting at the bottom, for physical objects, we have copies of physical objects. Those will be things like mirrors, photographs, shadows, all of that. Moving up, we have the actual physical objects. So that would be like an actual dog, an actual piece of pie. And then once we transition from physical reality that we interact with using sense perceptions to formal reality, this is where we get the most real things. So next we have mathematics, truths of mathematics and science, scientific principles, followed by the actual forms. And the forms are going to be the highest level of reality. Of course, at the top is the form of the good. Now, on the left side, we have the metaphysics, which is what exists. On the right side, we have the epistemology, which is our access to what exists. So starting at the bottom, when we're interacting with physical copies of physical objects, so a photograph of something, a drawing of something, a picture of something, we are at the very lowest epistemic level. All we can do is guess or conjecture about what reality might be like. And so if I just see a drawing of a giraffe, for example, I really have no idea what giraffes are like. All I can do is kind of guess about it. When we move up a little bit higher, we get to the level of belief. So if I actually go to the zoo and see a giraffe, then I might start to form beliefs about what giraffes are like. I might see that the giraffes at the zoo have long necks, and I might start to believe that all giraffes have long necks. But I don't know this yet. And the reason I don't know this yet is because when I'm interacting with the physical world using my sense perceptions, I'm relying on my fallible sense perceptions. I'm only seeing individual giraffes, not all of them at the same time. And everything is constantly changing. So perhaps today giraffes have long necks, but next week giraffes are going to have short necks or something like that. And so because giraffes change, I can't know from watching an individual giraffe that all giraffes have long necks. When we move up into the formal realm, that realm that we access using our mind and our reason rather than our sense perceptions, that's where we start to have strong epistemic justification. So as a review, when we're interacting with the principles of mathematics, science, we can have understanding. It's not just that we believe they are true, but we can sort of understand or see the reason why something is true. When we move up to interaction with the forms that are pure, we can have proper knowledge. So if I understand the form of beauty, then I know what it means for something to be beautiful. If I understand the form of justice, then I know what it means for something to be just. At the very top, we have the form of the good. And the form of the good is sort of the form of perfection itself. And of course, according to Plato, the form of the good generates everything on this side. It's the source. And it allows for everything on this side. So it allows for our access to information presented in the forms. Okay, so this is Plato's divided line, which we already discussed. And so Plato gives us one more allegory, and that's the allegory of the cave. And the allegory of the cave is meant to reproduce this information, but in another way. So I want to take a look at the allegory of the cave. All right. So Plato says, imagine that you're born, and when you're born in a cave. And so we'll put our cave down here. And when you're born into the cave, it's kind of weird because you're born basically sitting on the floor tied up. And so you're in the cave and you're tied up. And you've been here your entire life. So this is the only thing you've ever known, just sitting on a floor in a cave tied up. And there's a wall behind you. You can lean on it so you're not too uncomfortable. But this is your whole world. And as you sit on the floor in the cave, you get some entertainment. Basically, you look up at the wall and you see some images, some pictures on the wall that are moving around. Basically, you see some shadows. And so you might see, for example, a shadow that looks like this with a nice long neck. And another shadow that looks like this. And you might hear echoes coming from the walls. And so you see this image and you hear the echo of the sound giraffe. And you're like, oh, this shadow is a giraffe. And you see this image over here and you hear the echo of the sound tree. And you think, oh, this is a tree. Now, importantly, if this is the only thing you've ever seen and the only thing you've ever known, then you will think that this is an actual giraffe, not a shadow of a giraffe, not an image, not a copy. You'll think that's a real giraffe because it's the only giraffe you've ever seen. Likewise, you'll think this is a real tree because it's the only reality you've known. Now, Plato says, imagine you've been tied up looking at these shadows for a while, and then maybe your ropes get free and you get kind of curious. And so you start climbing around and you maybe climb. There you go. Maybe you climb over here and look at what's going on beyond the wall. And when you look beyond the wall, you see something really interesting. You see a fire. Here's my drawing of a fire. And you see some people who are carrying things. So maybe you see someone who's carrying a statue that looks very much like the shadow you saw on the wall. And when you see this person carrying the statue, and imagine there's another person carrying the tree, I'm sort of limited by space, you start to realize that the shadow you saw on the wall wasn't the real world. The real world is actually these statues, and the shadows are just copies of the statues. So you see people carrying statues back and forth, casting shadows on the wall, and you have this moment of realization, oh, this is a giraffe. This statue here is a giraffe. This other thing that I saw on the wall, that was just a copy of the giraffe. Now I know what reality is like. It's the statue. And, maybe you hang out here for a while. Maybe you hang out here forever. Maybe it's comfortable. But maybe after a while, you start to notice that behind the fire, there is a ladder. And that ladder goes up to an opening in the wall. And maybe you get really curious. And so you climb up this ladder. And let's say it leads to a tunnel. And so you climb up the ladder and you climb up the tunnel and then you burst out and you're like, hey, what is all this stuff out here that I've never seen before? And you're like, this is great. Wait, no, this is terrifying. This is all open and crazy. And so as soon as you climb out, you kind of crumple to the ground and just bury your head. And you're like, this is terrible. I don't like it. Make it go away. And you just sort of stare at the ground for a little bit. Good. After a while, though, you might start to get curious and you might start to look around. And so when you start to look around, and give myself a bit of a hill here to make this easier, when you start to look around and you start to kind of pick your head up and point it in different directions, at first, you're not going to look up, you're not going to look at the sky, you're just going to look at the ground. And out here, you might see images on the ground that look very similar to the images that you saw in the cave. And so you might see a dark image on the ground that looks like the thing that you were calling tree back in the cave. And you might see a dark image on the ground that looks like the thing that you were calling giraffe back in the cave. And they'll be similar to the images you saw in the cave, but they're going to have more detail. So this shadow is going to be kind of moving around in an organic way. It might be running up to the tree to take a bite. It might be kind of shaking. You might be able to see little bits of fur moving in the wind in the shadow. It's going to be much more detailed. Likewise, this tree is going to have a lot more detail. You'll be able to make out individual leaves, branches, and such. And so you'll realize that these have a lot more information contained in them than anything you saw in the cave. And so at this point, you might start to think that this stuff is real. But pretty quickly you realize you've been pointing your eyes at the ground and there's this whole other world out here that you can take a look at. And so eventually you sort of build up your confidence and you look up. And when you look up, what you see are objects that are way more lush and detailed and rich than anything that you ever saw in the cave or even on the ground here. And so you might look up and see a real tree, and it'll have individual leaves on it and branches and maybe one of those Winnie the Pooh holes in the front for, Winnie the Pooh to go and get honey, if you're familiar with that reference. If not, no worries. And the branches will be swaying. There might be bugs on it. There might be some moss. Way more detailed than anything you saw before. Likewise, you look over here and you see that generating that shadow is an actual giraffe. And the actual giraffe is, again, way more detailed than anything that you saw while you were in the cave or even looking at the ground. So this giraffe has spots, this giraffe has eyes, a mouth, ears, a tail, all of this. And then eventually you look up and you see the sun. And you realize that the sun is what is illuminating everything out here, and it's what is the source of everything. It's what's allowing the tree to grow, allowing the giraffe to frolic and live. And once you see this, once you see everything outside the cave, what you realize is that everything in the cave was a lie. It was just an imitation. Everything outside the cave, that's the real world. And outside the cave is a world of physical objects that run, are vibrant, have detail, and are much, much more real than anything inside the cave. Now, this is a story that takes place entirely in physical reality. But Plato meant it to represent the transition between focusing on the visual world and the conceptual realm. And so in this story, when you burst from the cave, what you've done, just like on our divided line, is gone between the physical realm and the formal realm. And each part of the story represents something on our divided line. So when you're sitting in a cave just looking at shadows on a wall, Plato thinks that's analogous to just looking at pictures or images or photographs, that very bottom part of our divided line. Once you look at the statues, Plato thinks that's analogous to when you start to look at real physical objects. And so when you're looking at a real horse or a piece of pumpkin pie, something like that, a real car, then you're looking at the statues in the story. But everything in the physical reality, everything we interact with our sense perceptions, is still part of the cave. It's only when we leave the cave and enter the conceptual formal realm that we start to access reality. Up here, again, everything here will be analogous to something on our divided line. So the shadows that you see on the ground outside the cave, those are meant to represent the mathematical objects on the divided line. So your triangles, your squares, your formulas. These physical objects out here, the ones that are the most real in the story, are meant to be analogous to the actual forms. And of course, the sun up at the top is meant to be the form of the good. Now, what's the point of this story? Well, the story has a few points. First of all, Plato says that the process of coming to realize that reality is more than what's in front of you, that it's the world of ideas beyond that, is like coming out of a cave. When you've lived in a cave your entire life, it's that kind of a transformative event. In addition, he's using this to explain his metaphysics, that everything outside the cave in the formal realm is so much more real than what we interact with in the physical realm. There's so much more out here conceptually than we could ever access just using our sense perceptions to interact with the physical realm. Now, there's one more part of the story, and it's that if you came out here and you saw all this stuff and you interacted with this reality, and then you went back into the cave, and let's imagine that there are other people in the cave. Put another person in there. There are other people in the cave that you came back to and you tried to tell them about formal reality. Plato thinks that they would be hostile. They would not want this information and they would probably reject it. And so Plato also uses this as kind of a story about what he thinks happened to Socrates. He thinks Socrates left the cave, accessed the formal realm, understood true reality, and then went back into the cave and tried to drag everybody else out by putting pressure on them, questioning them, getting them to think about things, getting them to understand the flaws in their views. Now, If you'd lived in a cave your entire life and somebody came running in screaming that this was all a lie and there was this other reality and you should follow them to go see it, you would probably think there was something weird going on with them. You might even get hostile. And that's exactly what Plato thinks happened to Socrates. He tried to bring people out of the cave. He tried to force people to sort of become enlightened, and they were very resistant to the point that they put him on trial and he ended up being executed. Okay. So again, I apologize for the format of this video. I'm working on getting a document cam so that you can see me while I'm doing this. And most of the time you'll see me and I'll be talking about slides. So that'll be a bit more intuitive. But this is just kind of to wrap up Plato. The other video I'll be posting is going to discuss Aristotle. Okay, thank you.